A simple woman stepped off the chopper into a fine mist of sea spray and engine wash. The steel deck under her boots rang with the weight of landing. Wind tugged at her navy windbreaker as she adjusted the faded blueprint tube over one shoulder. She didn't look up at the towering rig or the high-gloss panels overhead. She already knew every line of it. She had helped design its fail-safe loop 10 years ago, back when everything still ran on tactile switches and logic memory instead of real-time cloud overlays. The corridor into the operations wing was clean and silent, lined with light strips pulsing faintly under composite flooring. Crew members in sharp orange jumpsuits walked past her in confident pairs, white helmets under their arms. Most barely glanced at her. A few looked at her boots, then at the tube in her hand. No one spoke. She moved slowly, not because she was unsure, but because she didn't want to give anyone a reason to stop her. The walls around her were dotted with high-res displays and pressure graphs in live motion. She passed a polished plaque commemorating the platform's automation upgrade. It listed names of system architects. Hers wasn't among them. At the operations check-in, she stood still for a full minute before someone looked up. A young man in a black polo turned from his screen. "You lost, ma'am." "I'm looking for Trent," she said, "control lead." He smirked. "For what plumbing?" She held his gaze but said nothing. Behind him, someone laughed. A door hissed open to her right. Trent emerged with a datapad in hand, tall, sharp-featured, and moving fast. He paused when he saw her, squinting as if she were an optical error. "You with catering?" he asked. His tone wasn't cruel, just casual automatic, a practiced dismissal. "No," she said. "I came about the fail-safe routing. I built the primary manifold design for the—" "Oh," he interrupted. "One of the old drafts, from pre-rollout." He tapped his screen. "Look, we're full up on legacy consults. Nothing personal. Systems evolved. So, should the personnel." His voice dropped into a smirk. "But I'll let housekeeping know you're on deck." He turned without waiting for a reply. An intern appeared beside her, holding a tablet and avoiding her eyes. "You can wait in the mess hall," he said quietly. "We're at capacity on the ops floor." Riley followed him down a narrow glass corridor overlooking the control deck. Behind the glass, polished consoles blinked in pale blue. Engineers moved like clockwork. Every screen was touch-reactive, every movement smooth. The mess hall smelled like coffee and salt metal. She took a seat at the far corner table. Back to the wall. Her blueprint tube rested across her knees. She opened it slowly, unrolling the familiar weight of ink and yellowing paper. The lines were clean. The junctions still held. Around her, crew members came and went. None of them looked twice. A few stared at their phones. The room hummed with the low thrum of ocean vibration, mixed with laughter and metal clatter. Through the service window, she could see into the back kitchen. Above the equipment rack, a small red light blinked once. Then again, faint and rhythmically off-pattern. Riley didn't move. She just watched. The blueprint remained in her lap, her fingers resting lightly along its edge. The voices in the room kept rising. Behind the bulkhead glass, the alert light blinked again. This time, it stayed on. The mess hall had emptied out by late morning. Riley remained seated in the far corner, her blueprint unrolled just enough to show the manifold root and pressure bleed lines. She kept her gaze steady on the mounted screen near the ceiling. It streamed a live feed from the control deck, a view of interface panels, pressure readouts, and crew movement behind glass walls. The platform's soundscape shifted. Somewhere below, a rhythmic clatter had quieted, replaced by a different vibration. It was the kind of change only someone who had lived with systems would notice. She noticed. On the screen, a red pressure bar nudged up half a point, then back, then paused. It was the delay that caught her, not the spike. That hesitation between surge and correction wasn't random. It was feedback lag, exactly like the bypass loop failure she had modeled during the prototype phase. Back then, it had been theoretical. Now it was unfolding live. Riley stood and crossed to the auxiliary comm panel mounted near the mess hall door. The microphone was old, its grill smeared with fingerprints. She pressed the call button, waited for the tone, and spoke clearly. "This is Riley Morgan. You're showing a timing fault in pressure regulation. It may indicate an unstable bypass loop. I suggest running a manual check on the west manifold junction and isolating the tertiary regulator." There was silence for a second. Then the feed jumped as Trent's voice filled the room, riding the internal audio with a practiced smirk. "Thanks, Princess. Appreciate the ghost story. If the system needs an exorcism, we'll light a candle." A burst of laughter followed from somewhere off-screen. Riley didn't reply. She let go of the button and turned back toward the table. The feed shifted again. A young crewman appeared in the corner of the screen, pointing his phone at the monitor. 2 seconds later, the alert tone of a post went off at the other end of the room. Another followed. Someone whistled. "Pipe Princess warns of pressure ghosts," someone read aloud. A third man laughed hard enough to cough. She didn't move. She simply returned to her chair, closed her blueprint, and placed the tube across her knees. The screen continued its loop behind her. The red bar blinked again, slightly longer this time. The door opened 5 minutes later. A tall man entered gray jumpsuit, utility belt, and clipped badge. Graham, rig deck lead. His mouth was a tight line, and his voice came already full of conclusion. "We've had enough disruption. We're pulling your clearance," he said. "I reported a fault," Riley replied. "That's not disruption." He didn't look at her face. "You're not authorized to access internal systems. We have no record of active consultancy. For your safety, you'll stay off control floors." 2 crewmen came in behind him. One gestured toward her shoulder bag. The other touched his comms earpiece. She rose, slowly, didn't argue. The blueprint tube stayed in her grip. They didn't escort her with force. They didn't need to. Her movement through the corridor was watched by every eye. The crew members who had laughed now shifted awkwardly. One of them half smiled at her as she passed. She didn't return it. They walked her to a gray-painted stairwell near the rig's maintenance bulkhead. One of the crew opened the access door. She stepped through. The door shut behind her. She sat on the lower step. The space was quieter, dimmer. The only sound came from the distant pulse of the ocean pressure system and the mechanical hum beneath the rig's skin. She set the blueprint tube beside her and folded her hands in her lap. On the wall opposite, a red panel blinked. Not a full alarm. Just a quiet, diagnostic light. 1 blink, then a pause, another blink, then 2 in a row. Riley leaned forward slightly. That pattern wasn't random either. It was a coded pressure response, used only in the earliest versions of the emergency divert system, one that was supposed to have been overwritten years ago. She watched the sequence again. A pulse, a pause, then a pair of blinks. That system wasn't dead. It was still connected. She let out a slow breath and reached for the blueprint tube. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she rested her hand against it, feeling the cool surface press into her palm. Above her, footsteps echoed briefly down the metal stairs. Then silence returned. The rest of the rig was rising in tension. You could feel it even here, inside the metal bones of the structure. Another blink. This time, the pause was shorter. She didn't need access. She didn't need their permission. She needed that signal to repeat one more time exactly as she remembered from her old model calibration. Just once more to confirm that what she knew hadn't changed, even if everyone else had forgotten. It did. The light blinked. A pause. 2 more blinks. She stood up. The blueprint tube was back in her hand, and she turned toward the service door without a sound. The stairwell was silent except for the low thrum of turbines running beneath the rig. Riley sat motionless, blueprint still in her hand, eyes on the diagnostic panel above the access hatch. The light blinked again. This time, it was joined by a soft auditory ping barely audible through the steel. It was a bypass instability code. Older systems didn't issue full alarms for it. They blinked a quiet pattern, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. She rose without hesitation, blueprint tube tucked under her arm. She moved down the maintenance corridor without looking back. The walls were lined with cable trays and emergency hooks, their paint chipped and marked by years of wear. Nobody passed her. Nobody stopped her. This hallway hadn't seen a system tech in years. That made it perfect. She stopped outside a disused storage bay, one of the older compartments sealed since the automation retrofit. A push on the manual latch let her in. Inside. The air was heavy with the smell of rust and old hydraulic oil. Dim overhead strips flickered as she stepped inside. A metal table leaned against one wall. She cleared it with one sweep of her forearm and set the blueprint tube down. She opened the cap. The original drawings slid out onto the tabletop like old skin. She laid them flat, smoothing the corners with her palms. Then she pulled a folded cafeteria menu from her jacket pocket. The back was blank. She retrieved a grease pencil from the tube's side pocket and began to draw. The lines came back easily. Pressure flow from node 3. Emergency release from valve H13. The automated system had cut half these lines during upgrades, but the physical junctions still existed. The steel didn't vanish when the software changed. Footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor outside. She kept drawing. Her hand moved with precision, the pencil dragging dryly over the paper. The circuit routes aligned in her mind before they formed on the page. Muscle memory, not guesswork. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. She looked up. Mick stood there, older, oil-streaked, his work suit stained from collar to cuff. He didn't speak, just looked at the table, then at her face. She nodded once. He stepped into the room, looked over her shoulder at the menu drawing, and exhaled through his nose. Thought they wiped that design, he said. They wiped the front end, she replied, back end still buried in the junction housing. He reached into his back pocket and produced a flat brass key. Without a word, he crossed to the corner of the room where a rusted grating covered a recessed panel. He turned the lock, pulled the grate open, and flicked a breaker switch inside. A low, rising hum filled the room. Riley rolled up her blueprint and slid it back into the tube. She picked up the menu sheet and followed Mick through the narrow service tunnel behind the panel. It was dark except for a blinking yellow diode every few meters. At the end of the path, another door stood closed, paint peeled, handle greasy with age. Mick pressed his thumb against the mechanical scanner. The door opened. The chamber beyond was cold and silent. An analog terminal rested in the center, surrounded by dust and conduit, a full mechanical failsafe station. Abandoned, but not dead. Riley stepped forward and knelt beside the terminal. The paper was still in her hand. She laid it beside the dial. She wiped dust from the pressure monitor with her sleeve. The glass came clean. The gauge needle fluttered. She reached out and pressed the primer switch. It clicked once. Then, softly, the console lit up. The old green screen glowed faintly, bathing her face in light. She adjusted one of the dials and heard the quiet hiss of flow returning to the pipes overhead. Her breath slowed. The system hadn't forgotten her. It just needed a hand that still remembered how to ask. Behind her, Mick leaned against the wall and watched without a word. The hum deepened as the system aligned with the input flow. The air in the room changed. Lighter, focused. She reached for the main adjustment dial. It stuck slightly. She worked it gently back and forth until it loosened. The values on the screen began to shift. She didn't need access badges, passwords, or remote clearance. She had the root, the touch. The diagram lived in her hand. The room stayed quiet as the system cycled into standby. Everything she needed was in front of her now. The console, the pencil, and the path only she had kept alive. She placed the menu paper beside the screen, knelt lower to reach the second rotary switch, and adjusted the setting to match her original fault bypass pattern. The screen accepted the input without protest. The final valve awaited calibration. She moved slowly, aligning each indicator. She placed her finger on the primer for the failsafe valve. The steel beneath her fingertip was cold. Her hand didn't shake. She pressed down. The console flickered, then locked into green. One solid tone followed, low and steady. Mick let out a single breath. Riley didn't speak. She stared into the screen and watched the system hold. The dust had cleared. The sirens had stopped sounding like warnings. Now they were part of the air steady, blaring pulses that made conversation impossible without shouting. On the command floor, red light strobed across every screen, casting jittery patterns on faces too focused to hide their fear. Graham stood over the primary interface, barking orders that looped back on themselves. No one answered. No one had time. Behind him, Trent stared at the display. His fingers hovered over the console but didn't move. The software loop had crashed again, and the blowout preventer was no longer responding. Pressure had surged past the autolock threshold. They were supposed to fall back to remote overrides. None were responding. 10 decks below, Riley adjusted a brass torque valve with her bare hands. She didn't need alarms. She didn't need clearance. She had her diagram, her hands, and the weight of every hour spent inside these systems before the new crew had replaced touch with theory. The old console hummed steadily now, waiting for her to speak in its language. She inhaled through her nose, exhaled slowly, and leaned into the crank. Her boots slid slightly on the steel grate. She adjusted her stance and applied controlled force until the wheel turned with a groan. The gauge above the housing shifted, still red, but no longer blinking. That was the first change. Mick stood just inside the door, watching without moving. She moved to the second housing and began rotating the pressure release cap in quarter turns, her left hand feeling the vibration as the system began to bleed tension through the analog circuit. The line hissed, then equalized. She made 2 more adjustments. Above her, distant voices echoed through the pipe walls. The comms unit crackled with static, followed by clipped panic. "She's dumping it," someone said. "Then no, she's rerouting." Wait. The static cut out again. The gauges clicked into yellow, still too high, but no longer lethal. Riley stepped back from the console, wiped her palm against her pant leg, and reached for the manual lockout rod. It was stiff from disuse, but the seal cracked open after a few seconds of coaxing. She flipped the switch and re-engaged the legacy drain. The pressure line dropped half a bar in under a minute. The door behind her clicked. She didn't turn. She kept working. Footsteps, fast. Then a voice. "Hey, stop, you can't be down." Caleb skidded to a halt just inside the room. His eyes bounced from the console to the gauges to the analog display showing pressure bleed off. Riley didn't look at him. She adjusted the final dial with her thumb and watched the line flatten on the green arc. The mechanical needle settled. Mick stepped forward and placed a hand on Caleb's chest, not forcefully, but without question. "Let her work," he said. Caleb's mouth opened, closed. Then he nodded once, stepping back to the threshold. The old panel glowed softly. The console's hum deepened into something smoother, more alive. Airflow realigned. The vibration in the floor evened out. The rig's breathing changed. Less gasping, more focus. Riley sat back on her heels and looked up at the panel. The last gauge locked into green. She reached forward, tapped the system confirm twice, and let her hand rest on the metal for just a moment longer. It was warm now. She leaned against the frame, listening. The sirens had stopped. No announcement followed. Just silence. Above, the rig moved on without knowing yet that the worst had already been averted. Mick's voice broke the stillness. "She's stabilizing the whole damn rig." The analog console glowed steady in front of her, green across all zones except one. Riley sat cross-legged on the grated floor, her back straight, one hand resting lightly on a pressure dial, the other holding the folded cafeteria menu marked with grease pencil roots. Her breath matched the rhythm of the machinery now. She didn't need to think. Every movement came from memory. She reached for the final diversion cycle. The steel dial was smooth from years of handling, worn slightly on the edge. She turned it slowly, not out of hesitation, but precision. The pressure valve readout began to adjust in small, controlled increments. Not a surge, a balance. Far above, on the command floor, data feeds began blinking alive. Systems once thought severed lit up again, this time from manual source codes no one had used in a decade. Arden stood near the edge of the main deck, holding a tablet against her chest. She was the youngest on the crew. She tilted her head at the screen, blinked, and looked again. "That's stabilizing us," she said aloud. Graham turned, eyes wide. "What feed is that?" She pointed. "Legacy port. It says Station 3. Trent leaned in. "We shut that down 2 cycles ago. There's no input running from." The wall monitor above the center console switched views. A camera feed blinked into place, grainy but clear enough. A woman sat in front of an analog panel, hands moving with slow precision. No headset, no badge, no hesitation. For a moment, the room went quiet. "Who is that?" someone asked. No one answered. The next data stream confirmed a pressure lock. Flow redirection matched precisely the route Riley had designed on the menu sketch. Manual integrity signals climbed green, one after another. Down below, Riley adjusted the secondary bleed valve with 2 fingers, pausing after each 10th of rotation. The system responded immediately. A soft hum pulsed through the floor as pressure equalized. She moved to the next setting, flipped a toggle, and watched the numbers settle. Nothing in her face changed. She wiped the side of her hand across the dusty panel to clear the labels beneath the glass. The nameplate still read, "Fallback Node 3." A patch of tape beside it had her handwriting, a date from 8 years ago. It had never been removed. Above, another crew member leaned forward, voice quiet. "She's sinking the whole rig." Trent stared at the monitor. "We don't even use those channels anymore." Graham didn't speak. He just watched. Riley reached the final dial. It was stiffer than the others, unused for longer. She shifted her weight and applied pressure in a slow, even circle. The analog graph shifted again. No jagged spikes, no digital artifacts. Just a clean arc, curving into balance. The last red segment narrowed. She set the menu sketch beside the dial. One edge curled upward, stained faintly with oil. The final value on her drawing matched the gauge exactly. She took a deep breath, pressed both palms flat to the console, and waited. The graph stopped moving. It held. The overhead lights flickered once, then steadied. On the command deck, every set of eyes remained fixed on the screen. The final red light faded from the system diagram, replaced by a green pulse. Riley reached out, adjusted a single knob by half a degree, and set her hand back in her lap. She never looked up. The safety chopper landed just as the sun began to slip behind the ocean. The sky was a soft burn of gold and violet, casting long shadows across the steel deck. A hush had settled over the crew. No one called out. No one moved unless they had to. The rig was quiet, in a way it hadn't been since Riley arrived. She stepped onto the deck from the far maintenance corridor, walking calmly, the blueprint tube hanging loosely in one hand. Her boots left scuffed prints on the surface as she passed through the crew, who instinctively made space without thinking. There was no announcement, just the rhythm of her steps, and the shift in posture from those who had seen her on the screen and now saw her in person. No one laughed now. Graham walked out to meet her, his face stiff, his tone controlled. He had prepared for this moment, but the words still felt out of place. "You brought the system back," he said. "We'd like to acknowledge that, officially." Riley didn't stop walking until she reached the center of the deck. Then she paused, standing under a floodlight that bathed her in soft orange. The blueprint tube was still in her hand. "We're offering you a new role," Graham continued. "Chief of Legacy Systems Integration. It's yours if you want it." Riley looked at him, then glanced around at the crew gathered nearby. Trent stood at the edge of the group. His arms were crossed, but his shoulders had dropped. He couldn't meet her eyes. His voice stayed quiet. "You were right," he said, barely above a whisper. She didn't answer him. The wall-mounted screen near the main hatch was still running a feed. Someone had pulled up a paused frame from earlier, Riley seated at the analog console, her hands steady on the dial. The caption had changed. Where it once mocked her, now it simply read, "She stabilized the blowout." The crew watched her in silence. She looked at the screen for a moment, then turned back to Graham. "You don't need me here," she said. "You just need to stop forgetting who built the bones under your software." Graham didn't respond right away. His hand lifted slightly, like he meant to offer it in thanks or apology. Then he let it fall. Riley stepped to the nearest equipment crate and gently placed the blueprint tube on top. She didn't unwrap it. She didn't explain it. She left it standing upright, the label facing outward. A few feet away, Arden stood still with her tablet clutched to her chest. She looked younger than the rest, but she watched Riley with focus like someone memorizing every movement. Riley looked out at the ocean, then back toward the rig one final time. Her expression never changed. Calm, tired, done. She turned and began walking toward the helipad. Her windbreaker lifted slightly in the breeze, catching the fading light. No one tried to stop her. No one called her name. They simply watched. At the top of the stairs, she paused as the rotors began to spin again. The noise rolled over the platform. A few crew members instinctively looked down. Riley didn't wave. She didn't speak. She stepped into the cabin, closed the door behind her, and buckled in without ceremony. The chopper lifted slowly into the air. Below, the blueprint tube stood untouched in the center of the deck, its paper curled gently at the edge. The crate beneath it vibrated faintly from the wind, but the tube didn't fall. It remained upright as the last light faded, a single silent mark of what had been saved. The new system was installed without ceremony. On the schematic sheet, it appeared under a clean designation, Emergency Manual Shutoff. Revision 3. The console interface bore a small metal plate stamped with the name Riley 3. No announcement was made. No press release followed. The crew had already gone back to their routines, the system now just another tool in the chain of safety. But they all knew who had shown them what was possible again. Riley wasn't there to see it. She was 50 miles down the coast, where the land curved in to meet the sea. The workshop sat a few hundred feet back from the dunes, its roof bowed slightly from age, the wood darkened by salt and weather. Inside, the only sound was the faint hum of a table fan and the steady scratch of pencil on paper. The windows were open to the wind. Faint light spilled across the room, tracing the edges of an old workbench. A blueprint lay flat across its surface, weighted at the corners by smooth stones. The corners were curled from use, and pencil lines had been added by hand-thin, neat notations. Riley sat with one hand resting lightly on the edge of the page. Her other hand held a freshly sharpened pencil. She didn't rush. Each new line was tested in her head before it touched the page. The sea wind tugged gently at the paper, but she had worked this way for years. She barely noticed. The knock at the door was soft. She looked up, not surprised. Footsteps followed, cautious, measured. The door opened part way, and Arden stepped inside. She had changed out of her rig uniform. Her hair was pulled back. A small satchel was slung across one shoulder. "I wasn't sure you'd be here," Arden said. "I'm always here," Riley replied. They didn't fill the space with unnecessary words. Arden looked at the workbench, then at the pencil in Riley's hand. She stepped closer, carefully, like the air inside the room was too delicate to disrupt. "I want to learn," she said quietly. "Not how to use it, how to see it." Riley studied her for a long moment. She looked not at Arden's face, but at her hands. They were steady, not nervous, just waiting. She reached into the cup beside her and picked up a second pencil. She held it out, not with ceremony, but with quiet certainty. "Start with the lines that already exist," she said. Arden took the pencil. She stepped beside Riley at the bench and leaned in over the blueprint. Riley shifted slightly, making room. The lamp above them cast a soft circle of gold across the paper. Outside, the wind moved across the dunes in low waves, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed grass. They began to draw together. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The only sound was the soft slide of pencil over fiber, the movement of hands measuring, adjusting, building something new. Arden's lines were tentative at first, but they found rhythm. Riley didn't correct her. She only paused when needed, adjusting the angle, suggesting pressure, never pushing. The page slowly filled. The oil lamp hummed faintly beside them. The shutters creaked once as the breeze picked up. Distant gulls called above the dunes, and the sea whispered against the edge of land like it always had. The blueprint took shape beneath their hands. Riley didn't smile. She didn't need to. The work was steady. The rhythm was familiar. She hadn't come here to teach, but the pencil had left her hand without hesitation. That was enough. Arden kept drawing. Riley shifted slightly to take another piece of paper from the stack. She flattened it gently beside the first. The light caught its clean surface as her hand moved to draw the next set of lines, the foundation of a different system, one not yet real but already understood. The room stayed quiet. The sea moved, the pencil moved, the future waited. She was mocked for bringing a blueprint to a system built on screens, ignored, dismissed, and laughed off the deck as irrelevant. But when the new systems failed, when noise turned to panic, her hands moved with calm memory and restored what no one else could. Riley never demanded a seat at the table. She never needed applause. Her power lived in action, in legacy, in the lines others had forgotten how to read. And when the rig stood stable again, she left with the same quiet that had defined her all along. This is a story about quiet strength, about the value of experience that refuses to shout. If it moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts, leave a comment, or follow for more stories like this where stillness saves the day, and dignity never needs a microphone. Sometimes the person you overlook is already rebuilding the world.